And welcome back to Face the Nation. I'm Bob Schieffer. Margaret is off today. We have just come through Women's History Month, and here is some news. Historians are not only taking more notice of women of consequence, but more and more people are reading about them. Example one, Michelle Obama's memoir, Becoming. It is on its way to being the biggest selling memoir of all time. Today, we're going to focus on three more very different women of consequence who are the subjects of our new books by our panel. Lynne Olsen is the author of Madame Fourcade's Secret War. Susan Page's new book is The Matriarch, Barbara Bush in the Making of an American Dynasty. And Evan Thomas is with us to discuss his latest, First, Sandra Day O'Connor. Well, welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Evan, I want to start with you because in a rave review in the New York Times, Jeffrey Toobin, the legal analyst, said that she was perhaps the deciding vote in so many crucial cases, abortion, affirmative action, and the vote that gave the presidency to George W. Bush, for example, that she was the most consequential woman in American history.
Yes, in terms of her impact. I mean, obviously there have been a lot of great women in American history, so maybe that's a beat too far. but she had a big impact. I mean, if you preserve abortion rights and affirmative action for 25 years, and you're the first woman on the Supreme Court in history, that's a lot of power.
Could she have been confirmed today?
No. I don't think she would have been chosen today. She had no particular track record. I don't think that a modern Republican president, this one or anyone else, would name her because now they want a track record. They want to know how you're going to vote. And with her, it was a guess.
As you know, Sandra Day O'Connor and Barbara Bush were friends, but they were quite different. As the wife of one president and the mother of another, and also the mother of a governor, how influential will she be remembered as?
She was influential more behind the scenes than in public, but on issues like addressing the AIDS crisis, she played a big role behind the scenes in her husband's administration. And when it came to the Iraq War, she was a voice who spoke up against the Iraq War and the direction it was taking with her son until he finally told her to stop.
Marie Madeleine Fourcade, she was beautiful, she was brilliant, and she was a woman, and yet she led the largest intelligence service in occupied France.
That's right.
How did she do that?
It's particularly interesting because back then, France, well, in some degree still is, was an extremely patriarchal conservative society. And the idea of a woman doing anything like that was just beyond the pale. And
how did the men react to her?
I think part of it was she was as courageous as any man, and she was willing to be in the field with her agents. She was willing to face, and she did face, the same dangers that they did every day. She was captured twice by the Gestapo and escaped. So I think they got beyond her gender, and they saw her for what she was, which was this astonishing leader.
You know what I found interesting in all three of these books? These were not books really about icons, but about human beings. Right. There's some good and some bad in all three of these characters. And also what I found interesting, all of these books had love stories. You got a little scoop on that.
Yes, turns out that Bill Rehnquist, the Chief Justice of the United States, back in his law school days, actually proposed marriage to then Sandra Day was her name. Both Sandra O'Connor and Bill Rehnquist kept that a secret for the rest of their lives. They didn't even tell their families. My wife Osi and I found that in a box of correspondence. It wasn't in her regular papers. It was in her chambers in the basement. I don't think the family knew it was in the box. And there's this love letter, there are 14 love letters actually. And one says, "Sandy, will you marry me?" Now, the answer was no. She married John, she married the right guy, and Bill Rehnquist married the love of his life. So it all worked out in the end.
And Susan, of course, we all know about the love story between Barbara and George Bush, but you found out a lot about that.
Well, we know that it was essentially love at first sight at a high school dance over Christmas in 1941. Long marriage, 73 years, ups and downs during the marriage, a very fierce partnership. at the end. And at the very end, when I was interviewing Barbara Bush, she expressed no fear about dying, but she worried about dying before he did. And 2 days before she died, they had an incredible exchange where she said, "I'm not going to worry about you, George," and he said, "I'm not going to worry about you, Bar." He gave her permission to die. She gave him permission to live. And it was kind of the final statement of the love affair that started at that high school dance.
And then, of course, Madame Fourcade. This was quite an unusual love story.
This was an unusual love story, and again, like Evan, I didn't find out about it until last year when I was in Paris. Marie-Madeleine Fourcade wrote a memoir, and she talked very lovingly about her number two, her deputy in this network, who was a dashing Air Force pilot. When I was reading the memoir, I thought, there's more to it than what she's writing about. And as it turns out, she in fact did have an affair with this guy. She fell madly in love with him, he with her. They were both very passionate, charismatic people. And she got pregnant in the middle of the war. She got pregnant in November 1942. And she was on the run from the Gestapo while she was pregnant, going from place to place to place. Finally had the baby in June 1943 in Lyon. The love of her life was captured about 3 months later by the Gestapo and was executed toward the end of the war.
All three of these women made the most of being underestimated by the men they were dealing with.
Yes, she definitely did. Again, the idea of a woman doing what she did was just extraordinary. And she benefited, and other women in the resistance, women played a huge role in the French resistance. They were absolutely necessary. But Germans come from the same kind of society that the French do, very conservative, very traditional, very paternalistic. And of course, women don't do that kind of thing. They're either wives or mothers, and so you don't expect them to be out there, spying or. And so they got away with a lot initially.
And Evan, one of the things that struck me in your book is how much Sandra Day O'Connor learned from her mother and how her mother managed her father, especially when he'd been drinking too much, and how she used that when she was on the court.
Right. Sandra O'Connor was, her dad taught her about self-reliance and was loving and great, but her dad could be a little rough on her mom at night. And she watched the way her mom was not passive. She didn't roll over, but she avoided stupid fights. She didn't take the bait. She had a way of avoiding provocation and just walking away. This was very useful to Sandra O'Connor in dealing with men. Now, sometimes she did have to stand up to him. There's a great scene in the Arizona legislature. She's majority leader. The House Appropriations Committee chairman is a drunk, and she calls him on it. And he says, "If you were a man, I'd punch you in the nose." And she said to him, "If you were a man, you could." So she picked her shots. There were times when she did, but at other times, she walked away from the dumb fight.
Evan, I want to get back to you about how women in those days were dealing with men. And you talked about Sandra Day O'Connor and what she had learned from her mother. But there was one very important issue, and that was abortion, where the way she handled it with Scalia had an impact and turned around that issue.
Scalia was condescending to her. Big mistake. Scalia thought he had 5 votes to overturn Roe v. Wade, and it looked like he did. But Scalia could be a condescending person. And he was condescending to Tony Kennedy, who he thought was going to be the 5th vote. She was respectful to Justice Kennedy. And at the end of the day, she formed this little coalition and surprised Scalia. And by being modest and respectful and shrewd, she was able to winkle a vote away to her side and preserve abortion rights in the Casey case in 1992. That was a very subtle moment of human intelligence.
Did any of these women consider themselves feminists, Susan?
Well, I actually talked to Barbara Bush about that at some length because it seemed to me she walked the walk of a feminist. She was strong-minded, she was forceful, she didn't hesitate to speak up, whether you wanted to hear from her or not sometimes. But she refused to call herself a feminist. And I think that she felt that the women's movement had been disrespectful, at least in the early days, to women like her who had chosen to stay home and raise their family rather than pursue professional careers. She was mocked its points during her life. And there was a famous case, the Wellesley College commencement, where she was going to give the commencement address, which she did, but some of the graduating students had a petition saying she was an appropriate role model for them.
No, she definitely did not consider herself a feminist as we regard it now, because feminism wasn't even a blip on the radar screen in France back then. She was an extremely strong woman. She prided herself on gathering women like her into the network, but her main goal was to free France from the Germans. It wasn't to further a woman's cause.
Justice O'Connor was sort of a bridge. I mean, she had to be careful in Arizona politics not to come across as a woman's libber. So, she was careful about that and smart. But she did care about women's rights. Of course she did.
How did these three remarkable women deal with their own vulnerabilities?
You can't imagine, or I can't imagine, what it's like to know every day that you could be arrested and executed. I mean, that every day you were risking your life. And not only was she risking her own life, she was risking the lives of thousands of agents. And she felt that responsibility tremendously. So she was very, very aware of her vulnerabilities.
Susan, you wrote at one point that Barbara Bush became so upset that she contemplated suicide.
That's right. 1976, she had an empty nest at home. Her husband had taken a job heading the CIA, a job she had encouraged him not to take, by the way. She found herself falling into darkness. She told me that she would be driving her car and have an urge to plow into a tree or to steer into the path of an oncoming car, and she'd have to pull off the side of the road and stop and wait for the impulse to go away. She told me that she wasn't sure how she came out of this period of darkness after about 6 months, but one thing she did was she began to volunteer at a hospice. And there's maybe some lesson there that if you hit a rough patch, find somebody who's hit a rougher patch and help them, and it will help you.
How did these three women change in your own minds the more you got into this research?
Well, she, to me, became more lovable. I said earlier she could be a little scary journalist. She was suspicious around journalists, and rightly so. I found her to be formidable and a little cold. But as I got to know her and I got to know her family, I realized I was wrong about that. She wasn't, she was a good politician. She could work a crowd. But there was a part of her that she was never going to reveal. I think this is a key, actually, to her success.
I admired Barbara Bush. I thought she was formidable and consequential, and I thought her story hadn't been told. But one thing I found in writing this book is how much fun she was. Interviewing her was a treat. And her telling stories about her relationship with Nancy Reagan, for instance, it was as though she was reliving their friction from yesterday.
They didn't like one
They did not like each other.
Lynne?
I think pain and grief really stayed with Marie Madeleine for the rest of her life. After the war, she survived, as did a number of her top people. They went off. They were men. They went off and formed an airline, and they did all these great things. She basically devoted the rest of her life to the agents who survived, and especially to the wives and children of those who didn't. She raised money for them until the day she died to make sure that they could continue living, in a substantive way. France was not willing to give them much money, and she did her best to do everything she could for them.
Wow. Well, I'm sorry we have to leave it there. Thank you all for a great discussion, and we'll be right back with more.